The 17th of December, 1944, the Philippine Sea, approximately 500 miles east of Luzon. The water is not water anymore. It is a moving mountain range. Walls of black and gray sea rise to 60, 70, 80 feet, and then collapse onto the decks of the ships below, with a weight that bends steel. The wind has climbed past 100 miles per hour. It screams through every wire, every antenna, every gap in the superstructure with a pitch that sailors would later describe not as sound, but as something that gets inside your skull and does not leave. Aboard the USS Spence, a Gleaves-class destroyer, 8 years young, 348 feet long, the world has turned completely sideways. The ship rolls to 72 degrees. 72 degrees. The standard naval threshold for capsizing is 60. Every loose object in every compartment has become a projectile. Coffee cups, wrenches, fire extinguishers, men, all of it thrown against the port bulkhead as the hull tips past the point of reason. Below deck, the engine room is dark. The power has failed. The bilge pumps, the last line of defense against flooding, have gone silent. Seaman First Class Evan Fenn gripped a stanchion with both hands as the Spence tilted again. The metal was so cold his palms stuck to it. He could hear the hull groaning, a low structural sound that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the ship deciding whether to come back. He had been on watch for 6 hours. He had not eaten. The men around him were not speaking. Speaking required a certainty about the future that none of them possessed. At 11:23 inches the morning, the USS Spence rolled over and did not come back. She went down in under 60 seconds. Of her crew of 336 men, 24 survived. The Spence was not alone. 20 miles away, the USS Hull, another destroyer, was in her final moments. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander James Marks, had ordered his crew to abandon ship as the vessel lay on her side in the water, engines dead, superstructure shredded, life rafts torn away by the wind before a single man could reach them. The hull sank with 62 survivors from a crew of 264, and the USS Monaghan, the third destroyer, rolled and sank with no survivors among the first accounts. Eventually, 6 men were pulled from the water. 256 were gone. In the span of a single morning, the United States Navy lost 3 warships, 790 men, and nearly 146 aircraft destroyed or damaged aboard the fleet carriers caught in the same storm. The operation had a name, Typhoon Cobra. But sailors in the Pacific Fleet had another name for it. They called it Halsey's Typhoon, because every man who survived knew one thing with absolute certainty: they should never have been there. Admiral William Frederick Halsey, Jr. Bull Halsey, had driven the entire U.S. Third Fleet directly into the heart of a Category 1 typhoon, and the question that would consume a secret Navy inquiry, 2 investigations, and decades of historical debate was whether he had done so through unavoidable circumstance or through something far harder to forgive. Let us go back to where this began. By December 1944, the war in the Pacific had tilted decisively toward the Allies, but it had not broken. General Douglas MacArthur's forces had landed at Leyte in the Philippines in October, and the U.S. Navy, specifically Halsey's Third Fleet, was tasked with providing air cover for the ongoing ground campaign. That meant carriers needed aircraft. It meant destroyers needed fuel. And it meant that on December 17th, the entire fleet was scheduled to rendezvous at a designated refueling point roughly 500 miles east of Luzon and take on oil before returning to operations. It sounds routine. It was not. For 3 days, December 15th, 16th, and 17th, the fleet aerologist, Lieutenant Commander George Cosco, had been tracking a developing tropical weather system. Cosco's instruments showed a disturbance that was organizing rapidly. His weather maps, cross-referenced with reports from land-based stations in the Philippines and from other fleet units, pointed to a system intensifying into a full typhoon. He brought this information to Fleet Command. He laid the charts on the table. The problem was, the charts did not agree with each other. In 1944, the United States Navy's meteorological capability in the Western Pacific was, by any modern standard, primitive. There were no weather satellites. There were no reconnaissance aircraft dedicated to storm tracking. The fleet relied on ship-based barometers, radiosondes, and the instincts of men who had spent careers reading the ocean's behavior. Those instincts, in December 1944, were fragmented, contradictory, and at the command level ultimately disregarded. Costco's initial track estimate placed the storm moving westward, passing south of the fleet's position. A second estimate generated by the Joint Typhoon Warning Center in Hawaii put it on a northwestward track, which would bring it directly across the refueling rendezvous coordinates. A third estimate, produced by fleet staff officers who were not meteorologists, suggested the storm was a minor disturbance that would dissipate before reaching fleet strength. Halsey chose to believe the third estimate. This was not an accident of information. This was a decision made by a man who had built his entire command identity on aggression, on forward motion, on the refusal to be stopped by anything enemy or environment. Halsey's nickname, Bull, was not assigned by the press without reason. He was a naval officer who operated from his gut, who regarded caution as a moral failing, and who had been told by the Navy, by the press, by President Roosevelt himself, that he was one of the great fighting admirals of the age. That kind of praise does something to a man's perception of his own infallibility. When Costco approached him on the morning of December 16th with updated charts showing the storm intensifying and tracking northward toward the fleet, Halsey asked one question. He asked whether the refueling could still proceed. Costco said it could not be guaranteed. Halsey ordered the fleet to proceed to the refueling rendezvous. The destroyers were the most vulnerable ships in the fleet, and they were the most exposed to what was coming. Unlike the massive fleet carriers and battleships, vessels of 40, 50, 60,000 tons with deep keels and massive ballast, the destroyers of the Gleaves and Farragut classes were lean, light, and designed for speed and surface warfare, not for riding out typhoons. They had a critical vulnerability that every experienced destroyer officer understood: fuel tanks. When the tanks were full, they provided ballast. When they were empty or low, the ship became dangerously top-heavy. On December 17th, most of the destroyers in Halsey's fleet were low on fuel, some critically low because they had been operating at high tempo for weeks in support of the Leyte campaign and had not yet taken on fresh stores. Halsey knew this. The standard practice in such conditions was to pump ballast water into the empty fuel tanks to restore stability. Several destroyer commanders had already done so, or had requested permission to do so, and had been told to wait until after the refueling rendezvous, which was now being canceled and rescheduled, then canceled again, as the storm's position shifted, and the seas made alongside refueling impossible. The morning of December 17th arrived, not as a dawn but as an erasure. The sky and the sea became the same color, a heaving, gray-green nothing, and the wind, which had been building for 18 hours, crossed the threshold into something that no longer felt like weather. It felt like a decision. The barometer aboard the heavy cruiser USS Miami dropped so fast that the officer of the deck called the reading in twice because he assumed the instrument was broken. It was not broken. Barometric pressure, 27.3 inches of mercury. Full typhoon. The ships of Task Force 38 carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, scattered across hundreds of square miles of open ocean, were now inside the eye wall of Typhoon Cobra, and there was nowhere to go. Aboard the destroyer USS Hull, Commander Marks watched the inclinometer swing past 50 degrees and held his position at the bridge rail with both hands. His fuel tanks were at 15% capacity. He had requested permission to break from the formation the night before to seek sea room to maneuver independently away from the fleet formation and find a heading that might keep his ship stable. The request had been acknowledged and held pending clarification from Fleet Command. The clarification never came. At 10:43 a.m., Marks gave the order to abandon ship. He was in the water for more than 3 hours before a rescue ship found him. According to a Navy survivor's testimony filed in January 1945, Commander Marks stated plainly, "She gave everything she had and more than she had to give." The water temperature in the Philippine Sea in December is warm by Atlantic standards, roughly 82 degrees Fahrenheit. It should have been survivable, but the seas were so violent that men in life jackets were thrown against wreckage, pulled under by suction as ships went down, or simply separated from any possibility of rescue by wave sets that moved faster than any lifeboat could follow. Men who survived the sinking of the Spence reported floating for 36 hours before rescue ships found them. By then, of the hundreds who had gone into the water, only a fraction remained. The sharks came by the second day, and Halsey aboard his flagship, the battleship USS New Jersey, one of the largest warships in the world, a vessel so massive that the typhoon was for him a violent inconvenience rather than an existential threat, was piecing together, hour by hour, the magnitude of what had happened. Reports came in through the night and into the following morning. 3 destroyers gone. Aircraft torn from flight deck tie-downs and swept overboard. Sailors missing. The numbers climbed with each transmission, and each number represented a man who had been alive and cold and frightened in the water and then was not. 790 men, 3 ships, nearly 200 aircraft. The worst loss of life in the United States Navy from a non-combat event since Pearl Harbor. Now, standing at that moment, knowing what you know about the ignored weather reports, the low fuel states, the canceled refueling, the requests for sea room that went unanswered, ask yourself this: what would you have done if you were the officer who had to look Halsey in the eye and write the report? What do you write when the man responsible is also the man the president calls a hero? Tell me in the comments, because what the Navy did next is either the most pragmatic decision in military history or the coldest institutional betrayal of 790 dead men you will ever hear about. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, convened a formal court of inquiry on the 26th of December 1944, less than 10 days after the disaster. The court met aboard the USS Cascade in Ulithi Atoll. It was not public. It was not announced. The press, still operating under wartime censorship controls that gave the Navy broad authority over what could be reported, was told nothing. The 3-officer panel was headed by Vice Admiral John Hoover. Hoover was not a man known for softness. His reputation within the Navy was that of a precise, demanding, unsparing evaluator, the kind of officer who read every line of every report and asked the question most officers preferred not to answer. He took testimony from Halsey, from surviving destroyer commanders, from Costco, the aerologist, from fleet staff officers, from rescue personnel, from every man whose account could reconstruct the sequence of decisions that had ended with 3 ships at the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The testimony was devastating. Costco admitted he had presented multiple storm track estimates to Fleet Command, that the most dangerous estimate, the one placing the fleet in the typhoon's path, had been available as early as December 16th, and that he had communicated his concerns through proper channels. His concerns had not altered the fleet's course. Surviving destroyer commanders testified that their ships had been in dangerously low fuel states for over 24 hours before the storm struck, that requests for independent maneuvering had been delayed or unanswered, and that the formation speed and heading assigned by Fleet Command had been the worst possible configuration for ships in deteriorating sea conditions. One officer, a lieutenant commander whose name appears redacted in several versions of the court record, testified that on the morning of December 17th, at approximately 0800, the barometric pressure aboard his vessel had dropped to a level that left no ambiguity about what was coming. He had passed the reading to Fleet Command by radio. He had received no response. According to the Court of Inquiry's final report, filed in January 1945, the panel concluded that Admiral Halsey had committed errors in judgment, in failing to issue a timely fleet course change, in failing to adequately credit available weather data, and in failing to ensure that his destroyers had sufficient fuel stability before entering the storm zone. Errors in judgment. Those 3 words carried a specific legal weight in Navy regulations. They were, by the Code of Naval Justice, in effect in 1944, sufficient grounds to recommend a general court-martial. Hoover's panel recommended exactly that. The recommendation traveled up the chain of command to Fleet Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz reviewed it. He agreed that Halsey bore primary responsibility. He forwarded the file with his endorsement of the inquiry's findings. The file then reached Admiral Ernest King, Chief of Naval Operations, the most powerful naval officer in the United States, a man who answered directly to the Secretary of the Navy and to the President. King read the file. King closed the file. And then Admiral William Bull Halsey was not court-martialed. The reasons King gave in writing, in the official record, were a combination of pragmatic military logic and institutional self-protection that has been analyzed, defended, and condemned by naval historians ever since. King's position was this: Halsey was the Navy's most famous combat admiral. The war in the Pacific was not over. A public court-martial of the man the American press had christened the terror of the Japanese fleet would damage civilian morale, embolden Japanese propaganda, and destabilize the command structure of the Third Fleet at a moment when MacArthur's Philippine campaign still required naval air support. The war, King argued, had to come first. There was also the Roosevelt factor. Franklin Roosevelt had publicly praised Halsey on multiple occasions. He had endorsed Halsey's aggressive command style as exemplary of American fighting spirit. A court-martial of Halsey would have been, implicitly, a repudiation of Roosevelt's judgment, and in December 1944, with the president entering his fourth term and the war approaching its final phase, no one in the chain of command was willing to hand that political liability to the administration's critics. Halsey received a letter of admonition, a non-punitive administrative action that carried no reduction in rank, no loss of command, and no permanent mark on his service record in any meaningful operational sense. The letter was placed in his file. The file was classified. The inquiry's full findings were not released to the public until years after the war ended. 7 months later, in July 1945, Typhoon Viper struck the Third Fleet again. Halsey was still in command. The fleet suffered damage to more than 30 ships and lost 6 men. A second court of inquiry was convened. The findings again attributed poor meteorological judgment to fleet command. Again, no court-martial followed. Halsey was promoted to Fleet Admiral 5 stars in December 1945. He retired from the Navy in April 1947. He spent the years that followed writing his memoirs, making public appearances, and accepting the honors of a grateful nation that knew him as the man who had helped defeat Japan, not as the man whose decision on the 17th of December 1944 had sent 790 Americans into the sea. He died on the 16th of August 1959, at the age of 76, on Fisher's Island, New York. His death made the front pages. The obituaries mentioned Leyte Gulf. They mentioned his famous declaration after Pearl Harbor. Before we're through with him, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell. They mentioned his 5 stars and his presidential unit citations and his place in the pantheon of American naval heroes. They did not mention the Spence. They did not mention the Hull. They did not mention the Monaghan. The men of those ships, the ones who survived, came home to families who had received Western Union telegrams that said their fathers and brothers and sons were missing in action. Not killed in battle. Missing because the Navy, for months, did not publicly confirm the circumstances of the losses. Some families waited years for the full accounting. Some never received one that satisfied them. Seaman Second Class Robert Strand, one of 24 men pulled from the water after the Spence went down, returned to Iowa in 1946. He did not speak about the typhoon for nearly 30 years. His daughter, in an interview recorded in 1988, said he kept a photograph of the Spence on his bedroom dresser for the rest of his life. He never explained it to anyone who asked. He did not need to. The last formal acknowledgement of Typhoon Cobra's victims came in 1994, 50 years after the disaster, when the Navy placed a commemorative marker at Pearl Harbor. The names of the 790 men are there. They are arranged alphabetically, without rank, without the name of the ship that failed them, without any notation of the decisions that put them in the water. Just names. 790 names on a wall, in the warm Hawaiian sun, a long way from the Philippine Sea. If you had a grandfather, a great-uncle, a father, or anyone in your family who served in the United States Navy, or in any branch of the military, in any war, leave their name in the comments below. Just their name, or their name, and where they served. That is enough. That is more than enough. Because the thing that no military archive ever fully captures is the specific weight of a specific person, the way they laughed, the coffee they drank, the things they carried home and the things they left behind. The records tell us what happened to the fleet. Only the families know what happened to the men. 790 names on a wall. Say one more.